Have you ever discovered something that made you realize your whole life was built on a lie? The screaming started the same way every night. Deborah White stood on the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, dust devils spinning across the Afghan desert as the Apache lifted into the copper sky. Timothy Clark sat visible through the canopy for 3 seconds before the aircraft banked hard east toward the mountains. Then came the flash, brilliant white heat that painted the world in negative. The fuselage twisted mid-air rotors, tearing free, the whole machine corkscrewing toward Earth, trailing black smoke. Deborah ran toward the impact point boots, pounding concrete. But the distance stretched like taffy, and the flames kept growing until they devoured the horizon. Her eyes opened at 4:30 a.m., no alarm needed after 12 years of the same internal clock. The cabin walls pressed close in the darkness rough-hewn pine that still smelled faintly of resin. Deborah's hand moved without conscious thought to the nightstand drawer, fingers closing around the grip of her Glock 19, 3 seconds to scan the door, 5 more for both windows. The October wind rattled the glass in its frame, but nothing else stirred. Rex lifted his head from the braided rug beside her bed, ears forward, amber eyes catching the pre-dawn gray filtering through the curtains. The dog didn't whine or shift position. He just watched, the way he'd learned to watch over 5 years, the way rescue dogs learn to read the smallest changes in their humans. Deborah sat up slowly, shoulder joint grinding, with the familiar wrong sensation that no amount of physical therapy had ever fixed. The VA doctors had used words like adhesive capsulitis and chronic impingement syndrome, but what it meant was simple enough. Her left arm could barely raise above shoulder height, and every movement sent electricity down to her fingertips. She dressed in the dark, thermal underwear, wool socks darned at the heels, canvas work pants worn soft from years of use. The mirror over the dresser showed a stranger's face, all hard angles and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a functional ponytail. 58 years looked back at her, every one of them earned the difficult way. Deborah turned from the reflection and pulled on her boots. The cabin stood where the world ended, or at least where civilization gave up trying. No power lines ran this deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The diesel generator behind the property remained silent unless she needed to charge the battery bank or run the ancient refrigerator for more than an hour. A cast-iron wood stove dominated the main room, cold now, but ready when winter arrived in earnest. She'd built most of the furniture herself, from rough-cut lumber-simple designs that prioritized function over form. The work had kept her hands occupied during the first terrible year after she'd disappeared from her old life. The coffee maker ran on propane, same as the cook stove. Deborah filled the pot from the hand pump at the sink and set it to brew. While she waited, she performed the morning ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. Check the perimeter cameras, verify the motion sensors, confirm the driveway alarm remained armed. The security system was cobbled together from salvaged electronics and paranoia, but it had kept her alive this long. Outside, dawn crept across the ridgeline in shades of copper and gray. Mist pooled in the hollows between the mountains, thick enough to hide whole valleys. Deborah stood on the porch with her chipped enamel mug watching the forest wake. Once she'd lived differently. The organized chaos of aircraft maintenance bays stretched across her memory like scenes from someone else's biography. Balladeer Base, 2003 through 2008. The constant screaming of turboshaft engines, the smell of JP-8 fuel and hydraulic fluid, crews of mechanics working 18-hour shifts to keep helicopters flying, and Deborah had been the best of them. Senior Master Sergeant White, the only woman in the squadron who could disassemble and rebuild a T-700 engine by feel alone. But that was before the IED outside the base perimeter, before the medical evacuation and the surgeries and the slow understanding that her body would never work the same way again, before the VA system chewed her up and processed her through a year of physical therapy that left her with partial disability and a prescription for pills that made her feel like she was underwater. Before Timothy Clark died and the last thread connecting her to that world snapped clean through. The locals knew her only as the woman who fixed machines. When a tractor engine seized or a combine's hydraulics failed, someone would drive up the mountain road with cash in hand. Deborah would diagnose the problem, quote a price, and complete the repair without unnecessary conversation. They paid, she worked, and everyone maintained the comfortable distance she required to function. She hadn't spoken more than 50 words to another human being in the last month, and that suited her fine. Rex padded down the porch steps and waited tail making slow sweeps through the air. Their morning walk had calcified into ritual over the years. 8 miles through the forest, following the same deer trails and logging roads until Deborah could navigate them with her eyes closed. The exertion helped. When her muscles ached from the distance, the other pain became easier to ignore, easier to file away in the locked box where she kept everything that might otherwise paralyze her. The mist thickened as they descended into the first hollow moisture, beating on Deborah's jacket and turning her breath to steam. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood her own limitations intimately. The shoulder throbbed on cold mornings, a deep ache that radiated down her arm and up into her neck. She'd learned to compensate years ago to favor her right side, to plan every movement 3 steps ahead, so she never had to lift anything heavy with her left arm. Some mornings were worse than others. The worst mornings, she couldn't raise her arm past 90 degrees without her vision going white at the edges. Rex ranged ahead, nose working the ground, following scent trails only he could detect. Deborah let him lead. The dog knew these woods as well as she did, possibly better. They'd walked this route hundreds of times each trip, blurring into the next, until the path felt less like a choice and more like destiny. The routine mattered. Routine meant structure. Structure meant she didn't have to think about the fact that she was 58 years old and completely alone, that everyone she'd served with had moved forward while she'd retreated into the mountains, that the only living thing depending on her was an 11-year-old dog who'd been abandoned the same way she had. 23 minutes into the walk, Rex stopped. His entire body locked rigid ears, swiveling forward to focus on something through the trees to the northeast. Deborah's hand drifted to the fixed blade knife on her belt. Black bears sometimes wandered through this territory. She'd seen them from a distance, massive and utterly indifferent to human presence. But Rex's posture suggested something different. The dog's tail held low and still, his gaze fixed with a laser intensity on a point she couldn't see. Deborah had learned to trust those signals. Rex didn't alert for deer or squirrels or the wild turkeys that sometimes crossed the trail. This was something else. She whistled once low and sharp, and the dog fell back to her side. Together they pushed through a stand of mountain laurel branches scraping against her jacket with a sound like fingernails on cloth. The undergrowth grew denser here, wild and untouched by human passage. Deborah had never explored this section despite 12 years of walking these woods. Something about the terrain had always felt wrong, some nameless wariness that kept her on established routes. But Rex pulled ahead now with clear purpose, and Deborah followed because the alternative was turning back, and turning back had stopped being an option a long time ago. The trees opened suddenly into a clearing, choked with decades of accumulated growth, and they're half consumed by vines and moss and the slow appetite of the forest, sat an Apache attack helicopter. Deborah's breath stopped in her chest. Her brain refused the information her eyes provided. Attack helicopters didn't vanish into Appalachian wilderness. The military tracked every airframe, every flight hour, every component down to the last rivet. When aircraft went down, response teams deployed within hours. Crash sites got cordoned off, investigated, documented, cleared. They didn't sit undiscovered for what looked like 30 years. But the evidence sprawled before her, undeniable and impossible in equal measure. The fuselage had accordioned on impact, the nose section crushed into twisted metal. Main rotor blades hung at unnatural angles, some snapped clean through, others bent into question marks. Vines had grown up through the shattered canopy, nature methodically reclaiming what had once been a machine designed for killing. Rust consumed every exposed surface. The tail boom had partially separated, hanging askew in a way that made Deborah's mechanic's brain scream warnings about structural failure. She approached slowly, Rex pressed against her leg. The aircraft was an AH-64D Apache Block II. She could identify that much through the decay. Late 1990s production based on the sensor pod configuration. Serial numbers should have been stamped on the tail boom and fuselage near the cockpit, but someone had ground them away with methodical precision. Deep gouges scarred the metal where the identifying marks belonged, deliberate erasure of everything that might trace this machine back to its origin. Deborah's hands trembled as she reached the cockpit. The canopy had shattered into 1,000 fragments, safety glass now scattered across the pilot's seat like green crystals. And there, still strapped into the 5-point harness, sat what remained of whoever had been flying when the helicopter came down. The flight suit had rotted to rags over decades of exposure, hanging from bones in strips of faded Nomex. The helmet had cracked down, the center line split by some tremendous force. No dog tags hung from the exposed cervical vertebrae. No identification of any kind. Just bones and time and the terrible silence of the forest. But Deborah's trained eye caught something that made her stomach clench. A small hole in the back of the helmet, perfectly circular. The exit wound through the visor, much larger, the characteristic expansion pattern of a projectile fired at close range. This pilot hadn't died from the crash. Someone had executed him while he sat in the cockpit, either immediately before or after the aircraft hit ground. Her breathing came short and shallow. This wasn't an accident. This was murder dressed up as an aviation mishap, and someone had worked very hard to make sure it stayed hidden. The crash damage looked superficial compared to what she'd expect from catastrophic mechanical failure. The landing skids had absorbed most of the impact, buckling, but remaining largely intact. The engine housings showed scorch marks, but not the explosive damage associated with mid-air fire. This bird had come down hard but relatively controlled. Someone had flown it here deliberately, set it down in this remote clearing, and then made certain it would never leave. Deborah circled the wreckage, cataloging details, even as her pulse hammered in her ears. The floor panel beneath the pilot's seat showed signs of modification, a hidden access point that didn't appear in standard Apache configurations. She knelt beside the opening, careful not to disturb the remains above. Her fingers found the latch mechanism, military grade, and corroded, but still functional. The panel released with a reluctant click that sounded too loud in the clearing. Inside the compartment, wrapped in plastic sheeting and foam padding that had somehow survived the years, sat a military-grade hard drive. The casing remained intact, sealed against moisture and decay. Deborah lifted it carefully, surprised by the weight. This was no standard data storage device. The housing met MIL-STD-810G specifications designed to survive impacts that would destroy normal electronics, designed to withstand temperature extremes and electromagnetic pulses. The kind of drive used to protect information someone would kill to hide or die to reveal. A piece of paper had been folded alongside the drive edges, brown with age, but the center still legible where it had been protected from the elements. Deborah unfolded it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The handwriting hit her like a physical blow. Bold strokes, slightly irregular, the penmanship of someone who wrote quickly and with absolute conviction. Widow's Maw, T.C. Timothy Clark, the man whose death she'd watched in nightmares every night for 12 years, the friend who'd taught her to trust her instincts when the brass wanted her to follow protocol, the pilot who'd covered for her during her worst PTSD episodes, who'd promised her they'd both find peace eventually. Timothy, who, according to official records, had died when his helicopter exploded over Afghanistan in August. 2012, remains never recovered, wreckage scattered across a mountainside by the detonation. But what Deborah didn't know was that the skeleton in that cockpit had been waiting 12 years for someone to find him. She stood there in the clearing with the hard drive heavy in her hands, trying to process information that refused to assemble into coherent narrative. If Timothy had left this note, if he'd hidden this drive, then the official story about his death was a lie, which meant someone had killed him and made it look like an accident, which meant the drive contained something worth dying for, something dangerous enough that it had to be buried in the Blue Ridge Mountains and forgotten. The walk back to the cabin took 40 minutes, Deborah moving faster than her damaged shoulder wanted to allow. Rex stayed close, sensing her agitation, his usual wandering curtailed. The sun had climbed above the ridgeline by the time her cabin came into view, morning light slanting through the pines in golden shafts. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it, but Deborah's awareness had shifted fundamentally. The isolation that had felt like protection an hour ago now felt like exposure. Anyone could approach through these woods. Anyone could be watching. Inside, she laid the hard drive on the kitchen table and booted up her laptop. The machine was a relic, a Dell Latitude E6400 she'd kept from her Air Force days. Ruggedized case, military spec components, slow by modern standards, but reliable. It took 5 minutes to complete its boot sequence, the cooling fan wheezing as decade-old electronics struggled to life. Deborah connected the hard drive through a USB adapter, her hand steady now that she had a concrete problem to solve. The drive appeared in the system immediately, but accessing the data proved impossible. Military-grade AES 256 encryption locked every partition. A password prompt appeared on screen demanding 16 characters. Deborah tried the obvious combinations first: Timothy's birthday, his service number, the unit designation they'd both served under. Nothing worked. After the fifth failed attempt, a secondary screen appeared with a warning that 3 more failures would trigger permanent lockout and data erasure. She sat back, forcing herself to think methodically. Timothy had left this for someone to find, but he'd also ensured that only the right person could access it. The file metadata showed creation dates from mid-August 2012, just 2 weeks before his official death. The registered owner field displayed simply T. Clark. But what kind of password would Timothy use? What would he assume she'd remember after 12 years? Deborah tried the name of the bar in Oklahoma City where they'd celebrated her promotion to senior master sergeant. Failed. The model number of the first turbine engine they'd rebuilt together during technical school. Failed. 7 attempts total, 3 remaining before permanent lockout. A soft electronic chirp froze the blood in her veins. She hadn't heard that sound in years, but recognition came instantly. The hard drive had a secondary function she'd missed in her initial examination. Embedded somewhere in the sealed casing was a low-power GPS transponder activated the moment she'd connected the drive to her laptop. For the past 18 minutes, the device had been broadcasting its location to anyone monitoring the correct frequency. Deborah yanked the USB cable free and powered down the laptop. Too late. The damage was done. Someone, somewhere now knew that after 12 years of silence, Timothy Clark's hidden drive had been found and activated. She moved to the window, half expecting to see vehicles approaching up the dirt road. Nothing yet, but they would come. Whoever had killed the pilot in that Apache, whoever had ground away the serial numbers and buried the wreckage under decades of forest growth, they would come for this drive. And they would come for her. The decision tree was brutally simple: run or stay. If she ran, where would she go? Deborah had spent 12 years building this life of deliberate isolation. She had no family left, no close friends. The other veterans she'd served with had scattered across the country, most of them trying to forget the same things she couldn't. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the sheriff's department consisted of 3 deputies who spent their time handling drunk drivers and domestic disputes. They wouldn't understand this. They couldn't protect her even if they believed her story about finding a secret military helicopter in the woods. Deborah moved through the cabin with the efficiency of long practice, pulling gear from carefully organized storage. The military pack she'd kept under her bed emerged covered in dust, but intact. She loaded it methodically. The hard drive now wrapped in a Faraday bag constructed from aluminum foil and plastic to block further transmission. Her Glock 19 with 3 spare magazines, a compact first aid kit, water purification tablets, MRS technically past their expiration date, but still edible. A topographical map of the region marked with trails and landmarks only locals knew. And a smaller USB drive onto which she'd managed to copy the metadata from the encrypted files before disconnecting. Not much information, but something. The shoulder pain had intensified to a constant grinding sensation. Deborah swallowed 4 ibuprofen tablets, dry, and shouldered the pack. 25 pounds, maybe 30. More than she should carry with her injury, but less than she'd need for extended survival. Her gaze swept the cabin one final time. 12 years of her life contained in these walls, the coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter, the wood stove she'd installed with her own hands during that first brutal winter, the bed where she'd fought her nightmares into something approaching submission. Rex watched from the doorway, head cocked to one side. The dog understood something had fundamentally changed, even if he couldn't comprehend the specifics. Deborah knelt and scratched behind his ears, the gesture providing comfort to both of them. When everything you've built is taken from you, what do you have left to lose, and what would you risk to honor the dead? The question arrived unbidden, and with it came sudden clarity. For 12 years, Deborah had chosen silence. She'd retreated from the world convinced that the only path to survival was disconnection, that if she buried herself deep enough in isolation, the past couldn't reach her. But Timothy hadn't chosen silence. Whatever information he'd sealed inside that encrypted drive, whatever had gotten him killed, he'd believed it was worth preserving, worth dying for. And he'd trusted that eventually, somehow Deborah would find it and finish what he'd started. She couldn't outrun this, but maybe she didn't need to. The note had mentioned Widow's Maw, an abandoned coal mine approximately 75 miles north into the mountains. Deborah and Timothy had trained in this region back in 1998, learning cold weather survival and mountaineering as part of an Air Force cross-training initiative. She remembered the mine. They'd joked about it, about how it was the perfect place to hide something if you really needed it to stay hidden. At the time, it had been idle speculation between young service members with too much time on their hands. But Timothy had remembered. And if he'd left a backup here in the Apache, maybe he'd left something else at Widow's Maw. Another piece of the puzzle, a way to decrypt the drive, or at minimum a safer location to figure out her next move. The sound of rotor blades cut through the morning air, distant but approaching fast. A helicopter flying low and with clear purpose. Deborah's stomach dropped. She grabbed Rex by the collar and yanked open the trapdoor hidden beneath the kitchen table. The tunnel below was narrow and dark, a remnant from Prohibition era when bootleggers had used these mountains to run illegal whiskey. She'd discovered it during her first year in the cabin and kept it maintained, since never quite sure why. Insurance, maybe. An escape route if the past ever caught up. That time had arrived. Deborah pushed Rex into the opening and followed, pulling the trapdoor shut above them. Darkness swallowed everything. She clicked on a small LED flashlight, the beam barely adequate to illuminate the earthen walls, pressing in from all sides. The space was barely 60 centimeters wide, forcing her to crawl on her belly with the pack dragging behind. Her shoulders screamed. Each forward movement sent fresh agony radiating down her arm and up into her neck. The tunnel seemed to contract around her, dirt raining from the ceiling every time she shifted position. Rex whined ahead, unhappy but obedient. Deborah focused on breathing, on pushing forward 1 meter at a time, on the small circle of light that marked the exit growing incrementally larger. Behind her, muffled by meters of earth, came the sound of breaking glass. shouts in clipped professional tones, the methodical crash of doors being kicked in. They were searching the cabin, tearing it apart room by room. Deborah didn't look back. She couldn't. The tunnel demanded all her concentration, every fragment of will she had remaining. 8 minutes of crawling through suffocating darkness, 8 minutes of pain and fear, and the overwhelming certainty that the walls would collapse and bury her alive. Then Rex scrambled ahead and vanished, and Deborah dragged herself out into a dry streambed, gasping. The October air cut into her lungs like broken glass. She lay on her back for 10 seconds, maybe 15, just breathing and staring at the canopy overhead. The helicopter noise had faded. The aircraft likely landed near the cabin. How many operatives? 4 seemed standard for this kind of extraction. Maybe 6 if they wanted to be thorough. All of them armed, trained, and operating with the kind of authority that didn't require explanations. Deborah rolled to her feet and adjusted the pack on her good shoulder. The streambed ran east for half a mile before joining a larger creek. From there, she could follow the water north, staying off established trails, using the terrain to mask her movement. 75 miles to Widow's Maw through some of the roughest country in Virginia. At her age, with her injuries carrying this weight, she'd be fortunate to cover 10 miles per day, but what choice existed? Behind her, smoke began to rise above the tree line, visible through gaps in the forest. They were burning the cabin, destroying evidence, eliminating any trace of her presence. The sight should have devastated her, but Deborah felt only numbness. The life she'd built here had been an illusion anyway, a lie she'd told herself about safety and peace and the possibility of escape. Rex pressed against her leg, solid and warm, despite being soaked from the tunnel. Deborah rested her hand on the dog's head for a moment, drawing strength from the contact. At least she wasn't completely alone. Not yet. And somewhere ahead in the darkness of an abandoned mine, Timothy had left her answers, or he'd left her a trap. Either way, she'd find out, because running had never solved anything. Running had only delayed the reckoning. And Deborah White was done running. How far would you go to honor a promise to someone who saved your life? The question followed her into the forest as she turned north. Each step a small act of defiance against the people who'd tried to bury the truth. The people who'd killed Timothy and erased his helicopter from existence. The people who now hunted her through these mountains, not understanding they'd made a critical miscalculation. Because Deborah White might be 58 years old, might be broken by war and time and loss. But she was also the woman who'd rebuilt aircraft engines in complete darkness, who'd survived IED blasts and nightmares and 12 years of crushing solitude. She was done being afraid, done being silent. The forest closed around her like a promise and a threat in equal measure. Somewhere behind her, cabin burned. Somewhere ahead, the truth waited in shadow. And between those 2 points, Deborah walked forward, carrying the weight of the dead and the burden of promises she'd never asked to keep, but would honor anyway, because that's what you did for the people who'd stood beside you when the world caught fire. Word count 4,347. Status under target. Continuing to complete Part 1. The miles accumulated with brutal slowness. Deborah pushed through terrain that seemed designed to punish human passage. Slopes thick with mountain laurel forced her to crawl on hands and knees, branches clawing at her face and hands, creek crossings where the water ran fast and cold enough to steal sensation from her legs within seconds, ridgelines exposed to wind that cut through her jacket like it wasn't there. By noon, she'd covered maybe 5 miles. Her shoulder had progressed beyond pain into something worse, a constant electrical buzzing that made her want to vomit. She stopped beside a fallen oak and forced herself to eat an MRE, the chicken and rice, tasting like compressed cardboard, but providing necessary calories. Rex got half the entree and most of the crackers. The dog needed fuel just as much as she did. While she ate, Deborah pulled out the topographical map and performed calculations. 75 miles as the crow flies, but she wasn't a crow. Following terrain, avoiding roads, and established trails where they might expect her to travel the actual distance, approached 90 or 100 miles. At 5 miles per day, that meant 3 weeks minimum. She didn't have 3 weeks. Whoever was hunting her wouldn't give up after a few days. They'd saturate the area, bring in additional resources, track her methodically with technology she couldn't hope to evade indefinitely. She needed to move faster. The alternative was unacceptable. Deborah repacked the map and stood ignoring protests from every joint. The afternoon stretched ahead, hours of daylight remaining. She could manage another 5 miles before dark, maybe 6 if she pushed through the pain. The mathematics was merciless, but simple. Every mile covered now was 1 less mile tomorrow. And tomorrow she'd be even more depleted, even more damaged. The forest changed as she climbed higher into the mountains. Hardwoods gave way to spruce and fir, the air growing thinner and noticeably colder. Her breath misted in front of her face with each exhalation. She'd dressed in layers: synthetic base, layer fleece, middle layer, water-resistant shell, but the temperature was dropping faster than she'd anticipated. October in the Blue Ridge could be gentle, or it could be savage. This year seemed determined to prove the latter. Around 3 in the afternoon, Rex stopped with the same rigid attention he'd displayed that morning. Same posture, same laser focus on something Deborah couldn't perceive. She dropped into a crouch, hand moving to the Glock on her hip. Through the trees ahead, barely visible, a dirt road cut across the slope. And on that road sat a black SUV with tinted windows, engine idling, exhaust vapor rising into the cold air. They'd gotten ahead of her. Somehow they'd predicted her route or general direction and positioned a vehicle to intercept. Deborah eased backward, moving slowly to avoid attracting attention. But the SUV's doors opened and 2 men emerged, wearing civilian clothing that didn't quite hide their military bearing. Dark jackets, cargo pants, hiking boots. They moved with coordinated precision, each carrying a handheld device. They swept back and forth in methodical search patterns. Signal detectors. They were scanning for the GPS transponder in the hard drive. Deborah had wrapped it in a Faraday bag, but those weren't perfect shields. A powerful enough detector at close range might still pick up electromagnetic leakage. 2 choices presented themselves: circle wide around them, adding hours to her route and risking encounters with other teams that might be positioned elsewhere, or wait until dark and attempt to slip past under cover of darkness. Neither option felt good, but remaining stationary felt worse. Deborah whistled softly to Rex and began angling west away from the road and the searchers. The detour would cost her, but getting caught would cost everything. The terrain grew more brutal. Deborah found herself scrambling over boulder fields where one wrong step would mean a broken ankle or worse, skirting cliff faces where the drop-off disappeared into mist and shadow. Her hands bled from scrapes against rock. Her knees felt like they'd been worked over with hammers, but she kept moving, Rex beside her, the two of them a team forged in shared survival and mutual dependence. As the sun set, painting the western sky in shades of orange fading to purple, Deborah found a shallow cave formed by an overhanging rock shelf. Not much shelter, but enough to hide a small fire if she kept it contained and used dry wood that wouldn't produce smoke. She gathered dead pine branches, stripping away the needles and arranging the wood in a careful pyramid. A single waterproof match and flames licked upward with minimal smoke. The warmth felt like salvation. Deborah's hands thawed slowly, sensation returning in painful prickles. She heated water in her metal cup and made instant coffee, the taste bitter and absolutely perfect. Rex curled against her side, his body heat augmenting the fire's warmth. Together they watched darkness claim the forest completely, stars emerging one by one through the canopy overhead. For the first time since finding the helicopter, Deborah allowed herself to really examine what she'd discovered. Timothy Clark hadn't died in Afghanistan. Or if he had, it hadn't been in the official crash everyone was told about. Someone had brought him here to Virginia and executed him in the cockpit of an Apache that officially didn't exist. Then they'd hidden the wreckage and scrubbed the records clean, erasing him from history. But why? What had Timothy known or done that required such extreme measures, and why leave evidence behind encrypted and waiting? Unless Timothy had known what was coming, unless he'd prepared for his own death, setting up a dead man's switch to ensure the truth emerged, eventually triggered by someone he trusted to finish what he'd started. The hard drive in her pack suddenly felt heavier. Deborah pulled it out, still wrapped in its improvised Faraday bag, and turned it over in her hands. 16 characters to unlock whatever secrets Timothy had died protecting. 16 characters that could be anything, could represent years of futile guessing. Unless Deborah's mind drifted back to 1998, to the cold weather training exercise in these same mountains. She and Timothy had gotten separated from their unit during a navigation exercise, spent a miserable night huddled under an emergency shelter while sleet hammered down. They'd talked through the dark hours, sharing stories and fears and dreams to stay awake. At one point, Timothy had mentioned his daughter's birth date and his wedding anniversary, then laughed about combining them into passwords for everything important, because he could never remember random character strings. His daughter had been born April 3, 2001. His wedding anniversary was September 12, 1995. Deborah pulled out her small waterproof notebook and pencil, writing the numbers in sequence 04032001091211995. 16 characters exactly. It was a desperate hope, probably meaningless, but it was something concrete to try. She'd attempt it tomorrow at the mine, if she survived that long. Sleep came in fragments. Deborah dozed for an hour, jerked awake by nightmares that now featured the skeleton in the Apache cockpit. Dozed again. Her body was too wired and damaged to fully rest. Rex kept watch, the dog's senses far more reliable than any electronic alarm. When dawn crept over the ridgeline, Deborah felt more exhausted than when she'd laid down, but exhaustion was just another variable to manage and overcome. The second day proved harder than the first. Her shoulder had stiffened overnight, range of motion reduced to barely functional. Every time she used her left arm, white spots danced at the periphery of her vision. The ibuprofen helped marginally, but she was consuming her supply at an unsustainable rate. At this pace, she'd be out in 3 days, and then the pain would become unmanageable. The terrain continued its assault. Mountains grew steeper, valleys deeper, and shrouded in fog that turned the world into a gray maze. Deborah consulted her map during breaks, tracking progress against landmarks. She'd covered perhaps 15 miles total since leaving the cabin. 60 or more remained. The mathematics made her want to scream into the uncaring forest. Around midday she heard the helicopter again. Distant at first, then closer, the distinctive thump of rotor blades cutting air. Deborah pressed herself under a thick stand of hemlocks, Rex tight against her side. The aircraft passed overhead, low and slow. Rotor wash bending the treetops and showering them with needles and small branches. Through gaps in the foliage, she caught glimpses of black fuselage with no visible markings. Civilian in appearance, but military in function. The kind of helicopter private contractors used for operations that needed to stay off official books. It made 3 passes over the area before moving on. Margaret waited a full 20 minutes after the sound faded before continuing. They knew her general direction now. The net was tightening with each passing hour. That night, she didn't risk a fire. Temperature dropped below freezing, and Deborah huddled in her sleeping bag with Rex pressed against her for warmth. Her teeth chattered despite the layers. Hypothermia was a real threat, but so was giving away her position with firelight or smoke. She compromised by doing isometric exercises inside the sleeping bag, generating heat through muscle contractions, trying desperately not to think about how pathetic this had all become. 58 years old, hiding in the woods from people who wanted her dead, carrying secrets she didn't understand about a friend whose ghost had haunted her for 12 years. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life turning out when she'd enlisted at 18, full of conviction that she'd serve with honor and be part of something larger than herself. But what nobody knew, what Deborah herself had forgotten during the years of isolation, was that she'd never been the type to surrender. In Iraq, after the IED blast, doctors had told her she'd never regain full shoulder function. She'd proved them wrong through months of brutal rehabilitation that left her sobbing from pain, but ultimately functional. When the nightmares started, therapists had suggested medication to suppress the dreams. She'd refused, choosing instead to face them night after night, until they lost some of their power to paralyze her. She'd survived because she was stubborn, because she didn't know how to quit. And the people hunting her now were about to learn that lesson in the most direct way possible. The third day, Deborah's body began to fail in earnest. Her legs cramped with every step, muscles seizing in protest. Blisters had formed on her heels and burst raw flesh, screaming inside her boots with each footfall. The shoulder pain had evolved into something transcendent, a pure signal that drowned out nearly everything else. She stumbled more frequently, caught herself on trees and rocks, kept moving only through force of will that bordered on delusion. Rex stayed close, seeming to sense her deterioration. The dog nudged her hand when she stopped too long, his warm nose a reminder that she wasn't alone, that something still depended on her keeping going, no matter how impossible it felt. 25 miles covered now, according to her dead reckoning. 50 or more miles ahead. The numbers felt impossible, but Deborah had learned long ago that impossible just meant difficult and painful, not actually unachievable. 1 foot in front of the other, 1 mile at a time, until she reached Widow's Maw or died trying, because those were the only two outcomes left. How far would you go to honor a promise to someone who saved your life? That afternoon, on the third day, Deborah saw them. Not the searchers with their handheld detectors and coordinated sweeps. Something worse. A man stood on a ridge approximately 1 mile distant, silhouetted against the sky. He held binoculars to his face, scanning methodically. Even from this distance, Deborah could tell when the lenses found her, could sense the exact moment recognition occurred. The man's posture changed. He lowered the binoculars and pulled out a radio, spoke into it briefly, then began descending the ridge with purposeful speed, heading directly toward her position. They'd found her. Deborah ran. Not the measured pace she'd maintained for 3 days, but an all-out sprint, crashing through underbrush and low branches, her pack slamming against her spine with every stride. Rex kept pace easily, understanding urgency without needing explanation. Behind her, faint but growing louder, came sounds of pursuit, multiple sets of footsteps. They'd been waiting for visual confirmation of her position, and now they were converging. The ground dropped away suddenly, and Deborah skidded down a steep slope on her heels, barely maintaining balance. At the bottom, a creek ran fast and cold over moss-covered stones. She splashed into it without hesitation, water reaching mid-thigh, the shock stealing her breath. Upstream or downstream? Upstream would be harder, but might confuse any tracking dogs they brought in. She went upstream, fighting the current boots, slipping on submerged rocks. 100 meters, 200. Her legs burned, lungs heaving, the pack weighed impossibly heavy. Behind her, the pursuit sounds had faded, but she didn't trust that silence. They could be flanking, could be radioing for the helicopter again, could be setting up an ambush point ahead. The creek split around a small island choked with dense vegetation. Deborah hauled herself onto it and burrowed into the thickest tangle of brush she could find, Rex squeezing in beside her, both of them soaked and shivering. She fumbled the Glock free with numb fingers, chambered a round, set it on her lap. 12 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. 13 shots against however many they'd sent. Minutes crawled past. Then an hour. The cold seeped into Deborah's bones, making her shake so violently her teeth clacked together. Rex pressed closer, trying to share warmth neither of them possessed. She knew she needed to move, needed to find shelter and dry clothes before hypothermia took her. But fear of discovery kept her frozen in place, paralyzed by the certainty that any movement would give away her position. Finally, as full darkness fell and the forest became an impenetrable maze of shadows, Deborah forced herself to move. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. Getting the pack back on required 3 attempts, her hands too numb to grip the straps properly. But she managed it, and she and Rex stumbled away from the creek heading north by the stars, visible through breaks in the canopy, moving because stopping meant death. That night blurred into waking nightmare. Deborah walked and fell, and got up and walked again. Twice she hallucinated seeing Timothy standing ahead with his back turned, beckoning her forward. Once she thought she saw her mother sitting on a tree stump, dead 15 years, but shaking her head in profound disappointment. The mind performed strange tricks when pushed past its operational limits. Dawn found her collapsed beside a deer trail, Rex licking her face frantically. Deborah's eyes opened slowly, her body so stiff and cold she could barely move. But she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was still breathing and conscious and capable of forward motion. According to the map, she was now perhaps 30 miles from Widow's Maw. 2 more days of this torture, maybe 3, if her body continued degrading at its current rate. If she could just keep her cardiovascular system functioning that long, she'd make it. She'd find whatever Timothy had left for her. And then she'd figure out the next step, because planning too far ahead had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Deborah forced herself upright and kept walking, each step a small victory against the forces trying to stop her. The dead had asked for her help, had trusted her with their final secrets, and Deborah White had never been good at disappointing people, even when keeping promises cost her everything she had left. The 4th day passed in a fog of pain and determination. The terrain began to shift as she traveled deeper into the mountains. The valleys grew narrower, more choked with ancient growth. Streams became torrents that required careful crossing. The temperature continued dropping as elevation increased. Deborah's water supply was running low. She'd need to stop and purify more soon, but every stop felt like giving up ground she might never recover. Around what she estimated was noon, her watch had stopped working. After the creek crossing, she found a natural spring bubbling from between rocks. She filled her bottles and added purification tablets, forced herself to eat another MRE while she waited the required 30 minutes for the chemicals to work. The beef stew tasted like salted cardboard, but her body needed calories desperately. Rex lapped water from the spring, then collapsed in a patch of sunlight. The dog was exhausted too, paws raw from the miles. Deborah examined them carefully, applying antibiotic ointment from her first aid kit to the worst abrasions. Rex tolerated the treatment stoically, understanding on some level that she was trying to help. The brief rest helped marginally. When Deborah stood again, the world spun less violently. She could almost think clearly for the first time in 24 hours. The shoulder still throbbed with each heartbeat, but the pain had become so constant she'd learned to partition it off to function despite the signals screaming through her nervous system. That evening, as purple twilight bled across the sky, Deborah crested a ridge and saw it. Widow's Maw. The entrance to the abandoned coal mine gaped in the hillside below, like a mouth frozen in mid-scream. Rails, rusted to orange powder, led into darkness. Timber supports framed the opening, weathered gray and sagging, but still standing after decades of abandonment. No lights, no signs of recent human activity, just silence and decay, and the faint mineral smell of deep earth. She'd made it. Against all probability, against her body's protests and the hunters pursuing her, she'd covered 75 miles through some of the most brutal terrain in Virginia. Deborah felt no triumph, only a bone-deep exhaustion that made her want to lie down and never move again. But she couldn't stop now, not when answers waited in the darkness below. The descent to the mine entrance took another hour, Deborah moving carefully on the steep slope. Full darkness had fallen by the time she reached the gaping mouth. She clicked on her flashlight, the LED beam barely piercing the gloom inside. The air flowing from the tunnel was cold and metallic, carrying scents of rust and water and things best left forgotten. Rex whined softly, but didn't refuse when Deborah gestured him forward. Together they entered the mine, leaving the outside world behind. The main shaft gave way to a labyrinth of passages, each one propped up by rotting timbers that groaned under geological pressure. Deborah moved carefully, guided by the laminated map Timothy had tucked inside the pilot's gear, a contingency plan drawn by someone who knew he wouldn't survive to use it himself. The map showed the mine's layout in precise detail, marked with coordinates and cryptic notations that made sense only to someone with military training. The beam of her flashlight revealed graffiti on the walls, decades-old messages carved by miners or teenagers or other people who'd stumbled into this place seeking something. Jackson was here, 1987. Maria plus Tommy, stay out danger. The words felt like ghosts, fragments of other lives that had intersected with this space and moved on. Deborah consulted the map at each junction, following Timothy's route deeper into the mountain. The passages grew narrower, the ceiling lower. Water dripped from above each drop, echoing in the confined space. Twice she heard sounds that might have been falling rock, or might have been something else, something alive in the darkness. Rex stayed close, hackles raised. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking through claustrophobic tunnels, they reached it. A chamber where the walls sparkled faintly with embedded mineral deposits, and in the far corner beneath a stack of rusted mining equipment sat a black pelican case, military-grade waterproof, dust-covered, but untouched by time's worst ravages. Deborah dropped to her knees and cracked it open with trembling hands. Inside lay everything Timothy had promised, a thick bundle of documents sealed in plastic, a rugged micro SD card labeled Video Evidence in Permanent Marker, and at the very bottom, wrapped in foil and foam, a satellite phone. Not the modern kind with GPS tracking, but an older Iridium 9555 model from before the surveillance state became omnipresent. She pulled out the documents, first handling them with the reverence reserved for sacred texts, falsified manifests showing weapon transfers, shipping logs for high-grade military equipment, surface-to-air missiles, encrypted communications gear, night vision systems supposedly routed to U.S. military installations, but the paperwork didn't match standard procurement protocols. The weapons had been diverted, hidden behind layers of false documentation and shell corporations. The buyers, according to the manifest, included names Deborah recognized from intelligence briefings: Igor Volkov, the Syndicate, Eastern European arms dealers with confirmed ties to terrorist organizations operating across 3 continents. Someone had been selling American military hardware to people who would use it to kill American soldiers. Deborah's hand shook as she reached for the memory card. Her gut told her what she'd see, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. She powered up the satellite phone miraculously. The battery still held 15% charge, inserted the card, and opened the first video file. High-resolution footage clearly shot with a hidden camera. The timestamp read August 3, 2012. In the frame sat a woman behind a massive glass desk, posture perfect, expression controlled. The nameplate on the desk was barely visible, but legible. Jennifer Williams, CEO, Blackstone Defense Corp. Deborah had heard the name. Everyone in military circles had. Blackstone was one of the biggest private military contractors in the world. Revenue in the billions, connections reaching deep into Pentagon procurement and congressional appropriations committees. In the video, Jennifer Williams spoke calmly with a man whose face never fully appeared on camera, but the conversation was unmistakable. They were finalizing an arms transfer, speaking in code, but transparently arranging the sale of American weaponry to a foreign buyer who would never appear on any official documentation. Williams quoted prices in cryptocurrency, discussed delivery timelines through third-party logistics companies, laughed about regulatory oversight being a joke when you had the right people in your pocket. The video was 5 minutes of damning evidence that could bring down not just Blackstone, but potentially a dozen high-ranking officials who'd enabled this operation. Deborah shut off the video, her pulse hammering. This was what Timothy had died protecting. This was why they'd hunted him down and executed him and buried his helicopter where no one would ever find it. He'd discovered Blackstone's arms trafficking operation, and when he'd tried to report it through official channels, he'd learned that the corruption went too high. So he'd built this dead man's switch, this insurance policy hidden in the mountains, and trusted that eventually someone would trigger it. The documents included a letter handwritten in Timothy's distinctive scrawl. Deborah unfolded it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The words hit like physical blows. Timothy explained how he'd been recruited by Blackstone in 2011, told he'd be flying cargo shipments for military operations. By the time he realized what he was actually transporting, weapons being sold to America's enemies, he was in too deep to walk away. When he'd threatened to expose them, they'd made it clear what would happen. They had photos of Deborah's house. They knew her routines. If Timothy didn't cooperate, they'd kill her. So he'd continued flying their missions while secretly documenting everything, building this archive, planning for the day when they'd inevitably realize he was too much of a liability and eliminate him. The letter ended with instructions. If Deborah was reading this, Timothy was dead. She needed to get this evidence to someone who could act on it. A journalist named Jonathan Wright, who specialized in investigative reporting on military contractors. Wright was supposedly clean, supposedly one of the few reporters who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Timothy had included a phone number, but what Deborah didn't know was that the skeleton in that cockpit had been waiting 12 years for someone to find him. Wait, that wasn't right. She already knew that. The thought felt intrusive, like it belonged to someone else's narrative. Deborah shook her head, trying to clear the fog of exhaustion. For 12 years, Deborah thought she'd failed him. Now she realized he'd been waiting for her to be strong enough to finish what he started. The satellite phone still glowed faintly in her hand. Deborah stared at the number Timothy had written down. Jonathan Wright. One call could set everything in motion, but making that call meant exposing her position, meant trusting someone she'd never met, meant stepping out of the shadows she'd hidden in for 12 years. Her thumb hovered over the dial button. She made the call. The line rang 3 times before connecting. A man's voice answered, cautious but alert. "Right." Deborah's throat was so dry the first word came out as a rasp. She swallowed and tried again. "Mr. Wright, my name is Deborah White. I have evidence about Blackstone Defense Corp. Arms trafficking to terrorist organizations. Timothy Clark told me to contact you." Silence on the other end stretching long enough that Deborah wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Wright's voice came back suddenly urgent. "Timothy Clark? Jesus Christ, he's been dead for 12 years. Who the hell is this really? I told you who I am. I found evidence Timothy left behind, video documents, everything. I'm sitting in an abandoned mine looking at proof that Blackstone has been selling American weapons to enemies for over a decade." Another pause, shorter this time. "Where are you?" "That's not important yet. I need to know if you're willing to publish this. If I send you the evidence, will you run it?" Wright's voice shifted, became more professional, the tone of someone moving into reporter mode. "If it's legitimate, absolutely. This would be the biggest military corruption story in decades. But I need to see what you have, and we need to meet in person. I can't verify authenticity remotely." "There's a diner off Route 60 Silver Creek, 2 days from now. Come alone." "Wait, Ms. White, I'm in D.C. right now. I need more time to—" "2 days, Silver Creek Diner, noon. Bring your credentials so I know you're who you say you are. And come alone or I disappear." All right. I'll be there." "But Ms. White, if this is as big as you're saying, you need to be very careful. Blackstone has resources you can't imagine. They have people everywhere." "I know," Deborah said, and ended the call. She sat in the darkness of the mine, the phone cooling in her hand. The die was cast. In 2 days, she'd meet Wright and hand over the evidence. If he published it, the truth would finally emerge. If he was compromised or incompetent, she'd have to find another route. But at least she was moving forward instead of just surviving. Rex nudged her hand, bringing her back to immediate concerns. They needed rest, food. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept more than an hour consecutively. The mine felt safe enough, deep enough, that no one would stumble across them tonight. Deborah pulled out her sleeping bag and one of the emergency heat blankets, creating a makeshift shelter in the chamber. She was asleep within minutes, a deep dreamless black that swallowed her whole. When she woke, her internal clock suggested morning, but in the mind's absolute darkness, that meant nothing. Deborah checked her watch, still broken, and decided it didn't matter. She ate an MRE cold, shared it with Rex, and spent an hour just sitting and thinking. The call to Wright bothered her, something about his tone. She replayed the conversation in her memory, analyzing each word choice, each pause. He'd seemed genuinely surprised about Timothy, genuinely interested in the story. But there'd been something else, too. A quality she couldn't quite name. Deborah was reaching for the satellite phone to check if Wright had tried calling back when she heard it. A voice from the mine entrance, distorted by echoes but unmistakable. "Deborah White, we know you're in there. Come out. We just want to talk." Her blood turned to ice. They'd found her. Somehow, impossibly, they'd tracked her to Widow's Maw. Had they been monitoring satellite frequencies? Had Wright reported the call? Or had they simply predicted she'd come here based on Timothy's known history? The voice came again, closer now, multiple sets of footsteps echoing through the passages. "Ms. White, my name is Eric King. I'm with the FBI. We're here to help you. We know you have evidence related to Timothy Clark. We want to protect you, but you need to come out. This mine isn't safe, FBI. That should have been reassuring. Instead, every instinct screamed danger. If the FBI was involved, why hadn't they been investigating Blackstone already? Why show up now at this exact location with perfect timing? Deborah grabbed her pack and the Pelican case, gesturing Rex to follow. The map showed multiple passages leading deeper into the mountain, including an emergency exit on the far side that miners had used decades ago. If it wasn't collapsed, if the timbers still held, she might be able to reach it. She moved quickly through the darkness flashlight, off to avoid giving away her position, navigating by memory and touch. Behind her, the voices grew louder, multiplying. At least 6 people, maybe more. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Ms. Wyatt, we will use tear gas if you don't respond. You have 5 minutes. Deborah reached the junction and consulted the map by holding it inches from her face in the blackness. Left passage led to the emergency exit. Right passage dead-ended at a collapsed section. Straight ahead descended to flooded lower levels. She went left. Rex pressed against her leg. The passage narrowed dramatically, forcing her to turn sideways in places. The Pelican case scraped against rock walls. Her shoulder screamed as she wedged herself through gaps barely wide enough for her frame. But she kept moving because the alternative was capture, and capture meant death, even if they called it protective custody. Behind her, closer than she'd like, came sounds of pursuit. They'd figured out which route she'd taken. Flashlight beams played across walls behind her, casting crazy shadows. Someone shouted for her to stop, that they only wanted to help, using the reassuring tones that came from hostage negotiation training. Deborah didn't stop. The passage opened into another chamber, this one with a rusted ladder bolted to the wall, leading upward toward a shaft that hopefully led to the surface. She slung the pack onto her back, tucked the Pelican case under one arm, and started climbing. Each rung protested with groans and flakes of oxidized metal. Rex couldn't follow. Deborah hesitated, looking down at the dog. "Stay," she whispered, knowing he wouldn't understand, knowing she might be abandoning him. But Rex sat tail wagging slightly, trusting her completely. Deborah climbed. 20 feet, 40. Her damaged shoulder threatened to give out with every pull upward. Above her, faint gray light suggested an opening. Behind and below, the pursuit entered the chamber. Someone shouted up at her, "Ms. White, stop! That shaft isn't stable." As if to prove the point, the rung under her left foot snapped. Deborah's full weight transferred to her hands, and the metal groaned. She scrambled, found purchase with her boots against the rock wall itself, kept climbing. The Pelican case banged against the ladder, threatening to knock her loose. 80 feet, 100. The surface was close now. She could smell fresh air. Behind her, one of the pursuers had started climbing the ladder. She could hear the rhythmic clank of their ascent. Deborah reached the top and hauled herself out into cold morning air. The exit was a collapsed ventilation shaft half buried under decades of fallen timber and leaves. She crawled out and immediately started covering her tracks, pulling debris over the opening. It wouldn't stop them, but it might slow them down. She was on the far side of the mountain from where she'd entered, miles from any road. The sun hung low in the east, suggesting she'd been underground most of the night and into morning. Deborah didn't wait to orient herself properly. She just ran, clutching the Pelican case, putting distance between herself and the mine. After a mile, she had to stop, lungs burning, legs shaking. She'd left Rex behind. The thought hit her like a physical blow. After 5 years together, after everything they'd survived, she'd abandoned him in that mine. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced it down. Rex was smart. Rex would find a way out. He had to, and she had evidence to protect. Evidence that people had killed for would kill for again. That had to be the priority. Deborah consulted her map, trying to figure out where she was. The terrain looked vaguely familiar, but nothing quite matched. She needed to get to Silver Creek Diner by tomorrow noon. That meant finding a road, finding transportation. She couldn't walk there in time, not in her current condition. Movement caught her eye. Deborah dropped flat behind a fallen log, making herself small. Through the trees she could see a dirt road, and on that road a single vehicle. A pickup truck, old and battered, driven by someone who looked like a local farmer or logger based on the rifle rack in the rear window. A terrible idea began forming in her mind. She needed that truck, or at the very least, she needed a ride. But approaching a stranger while looking like she'd been living in the woods for a week would raise every imaginable red flag. Unless Deborah waited until the truck was out of sight, then stumbled down to the road and positioned herself in the middle of the narrow lane, sitting down and looking as injured and helpless as possible, which wasn't hard given her actual state. She hid the pack and pelican case in the brush and kept only her jacket and the Glock concealed under it. 10 minutes later, she heard another vehicle approaching. Deborah slumped forward, making herself look even more distressed. The vehicle came around the bend and slowed. A different pickup, this one slightly newer, driven by a woman in her 60s. The truck stopped. The driver's window rolled down. "Honey, are you all right?" Deborah looked up, letting exhaustion show through. "I was hiking, got separated from my group, fell down a slope. I think my ankle's sprained. Can you help me?" The woman's expression showed concern and suspicion in equal measure. "Where's your hiking group now?" "They went ahead. I couldn't keep up. I just need a ride to the nearest town. I can pay you." The woman studied her for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Get in. I'm heading to Pineville. That's about 40 minutes east." "Thank you. God, thank you so much." Deborah retrieved her pack and case from the brush, climbed into the passenger seat, and tried not to look like someone fleeing from federal agents. The woman pulled back onto the road, and they drove in silence for several miles before she spoke again. "You look like hell, honey. When's the last time you ate something hot?" "I don't remember." "There's a diner in Pineville. I'll drop you there. You can clean up and call someone to come get you." Perfect. Pineville would have what she needed: internet access, a way to upload the evidence as insurance before meeting Wright. Because the more Deborah thought about that phone call, the more something felt wrong. When the system is rigged and everyone becomes an enemy, how do you know what's worth fighting for? The question haunted her as the truck carried her down the mountain toward whatever came next. She'd lost her home, lost her dog, lost 12 years of carefully constructed isolation. But she'd gained something too: purpose, direction. The evidence in the case beside her represented the last testament of a man who'd believed truth mattered more than survival. Deborah intended to prove him right even if it killed her. Word count 4,744. Status under target. Continuing Part 2. The diner in Pineville was exactly what Deborah needed. Small, anonymous, the kind of place where nobody asked questions as long as you paid cash. The woman who'd given her a ride dropped her off with a final concerned look and drove away. Deborah waited until the truck disappeared, then entered the diner and claimed a booth in the back corner with sight lines to both exits. A waitress approached, middle-aged and tired, notepad ready. "Coffee, please, and whatever your breakfast special is." While she waited, Deborah assessed her situation with brutal honesty. She looked like hell. 5 days in the wilderness showed in her torn clothing, scratched hands, and the hollow look around her eyes. The shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. She probably smelled worse than she looked, but at least she was alive and still had the evidence. The coffee arrived, and Deborah wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into her palms. The food came minutes later: eggs, bacon toast, hash browns, and she ate methodically, forcing herself to chew slowly despite her body's demands to simply shovel it all in as fast as possible. When she finished, she approached the waitress again. "Is there a library in town? Somewhere with public computers?" "Library's 2 blocks north. Opens at 10. Deborah checked the wall clock. 9:15. She had time. She paid for the meal with crumpled bills from her pack and left a generous tip. Then she locked herself in the diner's bathroom and attempted to make herself look less like a fugitive. Cold water on her face, dirt scrubbed from her hands, hair pulled back into a severe ponytail. The woman staring back from the mirror looked gaunt and haunted, but at least presentable. It would have to be enough. The library was small but functional, 3 computers available for public use. Deborah claimed one in the corner, logged into a temporary email account she'd set up years ago but never used, and began uploading. The video files were large, requiring compression and multiple attempts. While they processed, she scanned the documents and converted them to PDF. Everything went to the temporary account then, from there to 7 different locations: WikiLeaks, the New York Times Investigations Desk, Washington Post, ProPublica, 3 independent YouTube channels that specialized in military contractor investigations, and Reddit, because sometimes the most chaotic distribution method was also the most resilient. With each upload, Deborah included the same message: "My name is Deborah White, former USAF mechanic. This is proof that Blackstone Defense Corp has been selling weapons to terrorist organizations for over 12 years, with help from corrupt officials at the highest levels. My friend Timothy Clark was held captive since 2012, forced to pilot arms shipments. They tried to kill me to silence this. They won't succeed. This is for every veteran betrayed by the system we served." The uploads took 90 minutes. Deborah sat rigid in the uncomfortable chair, watching progress bars creep across the screen, acutely aware that every minute she spent here was another minute they could triangulate her position. But this was necessary. If something happened to her before she could meet right, the evidence needed to be out in the world where it couldn't be suppressed. When the final upload completed, she cleared the browser history, logged out, and left the library. On the street, she checked for surveillance, but saw nothing obvious. No black SUVs, no men in tactical gear trying to look casual, just a quiet mountain town going about its business. Deborah found a small motel on the edge of town, the kind that still took cash, and didn't ask for identification, as long as you paid up front. She rented a room for one night, locked herself inside, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came instantly, a deep, unconscious state her body demanded after days of deprivation. But even in sleep, part of her remained vigilant. When footsteps passed in the hallway outside her room, her hand moved automatically toward the clock on the nightstand. When a door slammed somewhere in the building, she jerked awake momentarily before exhaustion dragged her back under. She woke at 3 a.m., disoriented and aching. The room was dark, except for amber light filtering through thin curtains from the parking lot. Deborah lay still, listening for any sound that suggested danger. Nothing, just the hum of a vending machine outside and distant traffic on the highway. Tomorrow, she'd meet Jonathan Wright. Tomorrow, the truth would start coming out, assuming Wright was who he claimed to be. And if he wasn't, well, the evidence was already uploaded. The genie was out of the bottle, whether Blackstone liked it or not. Deborah allowed herself a moment of something almost like hope. Then she got up, checked the Pelican case to make sure it was still secure, and prepared for whatever tomorrow would bring. The morning came too quickly. Deborah woke at dawn, used the motel's shower to scrub away days of accumulated grime, and assessed herself in the mirror. The hot water had helped marginally, but she still looked like someone emerging from a war zone, because that's exactly what she was. She had 8 hours before the meeting at Silver Creek Diner. 8 hours to prepare, to plan, to think through every possible contingency. But sitting in the motel room made her feel trapped. She needed to move, needed to be doing something productive. Deborah checked out of the motel and walked to a small outdoor supply store she'd noticed the previous day. Inside, she bought a cheap prepaid phone, activated it with cash, and sent a single text message to the number Wright had called from. Silver Creek Diner, noon, come alone. No response came immediately. Deborah pocketed the phone and walked to the local diner, different from the one she'd eaten at yesterday, and ordered coffee. She sat in a booth and watched the town wake up around her. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, going to work, running errands, living lives untouched by the darkness she carried in her backpack. At 11 a.m., she walked to a gas station and paid cash for a ride from a teenager who looked like he'd drive anyone anywhere for $20. Silver Creek was 30 miles away, the diner visible from the highway. Deborah had him drop her 2 blocks away. She approached on foot, studying the area. The diner sat alone on a strip of commercial development, surrounded by parking lot. No obvious surveillance. A handful of vehicles parked outside, none of them the black SUVs or unmarked sedans she associated with government operations. Deborah entered the diner at 11:55, found a booth near the back with clear sight lines, ordered coffee, and waited. Noon came and went. No Wright. 12:15, 12:30. Deborah's unease grew with each passing minute. Had Wright decided not to come? Had something prevented him, or had this been a trap from the beginning? At 12:45, a man entered the diner, mid-40s, dressed casually, but well carrying a leather messenger bag. He looked around, spotted Deborah, and approached with a professional smile. "Ms. White, Mr. Wright, Jonathan, please." He slid into the booth across from her, setting the messenger bag on the seat beside him. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic from DC was worse than expected." Deborah studied him, trying to read his face, his body language, anything that might suggest threat or deception. He looked normal, looked exactly like a journalist would look, but that's what made her suspicious. "You came alone, completely alone, just like you asked." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I have to tell you, Miss White, your message was extraordinary. If you really have evidence of what you're claiming, I do. Then this could be the biggest military corruption story since Abu Ghraib. Potentially bigger, but I need to see it. I need to verify authenticity before I can publish anything." Deborah's hand moved to the Pelican case on the seat beside her, but something stopped her, some instinct she couldn't name. She looked at Wright, really looked, and saw something in his eyes, a calculation, a predator's patience. "Before I show you anything, I need to see your credentials, press pass, identification, something that proves you're really Jonathan Wright with the Post." Wright's smile never wavered, but something changed in his expression. Just the smallest shift. "Of course, absolutely." He reached for his wallet, pulled out a press credential that looked legitimate, slid it across the table. Deborah examined it. Everything looked correct, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She looked up at Wright, and in that moment saw his attention flick briefly toward the diner's front window. Just a glance, barely a second. But enough. Deborah followed his gaze and saw them. Two men approaching from different directions in the parking lot, moving with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. Both had their hands near their waistbands where weapons would be concealed. Her stomach dropped. This was the trap. She looked back at Wright, and his smile had vanished, replaced by something harder. "Ms. White, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Blackstone would really like to have that evidence back, and they're willing to pay very generously for its return. More money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. No one needs to get hurt. You just hand over the case and walk away rich." Deborah's hand closed around the Glock under the table. "You're not a journalist." "Oh, I am. Just one with better funding sources than most. Blackstone's been very good to me over the years, and they'll be very good to you if you're smart about this." "Timothy Clark is alive, isn't he?" The words came out before Deborah fully processed the thought. "That's why you're all so desperate. He's not dead. You've been holding him somewhere, using him. And if this evidence comes out, if people start asking questions, someone might find him." Wright's expression confirmed it before he spoke. "I really can't discuss operational details. But yes, let's just say Timothy has been useful to Blackstone's operations over the years. Much too useful to simply discard. Now, Ms. White, those men outside are going to come in here in about 30 seconds. You can do this the easy way or the very difficult way. What's it going to be?" Deborah stood the Pelican case in her left hand, the Glock in her right, though still concealed under the table. "The difficult way," she said, and threw the coffee pot from the table at Wright's face. He jerked back, arms up reflexively. Deborah was already moving, heading for the kitchen door she'd identified when she first entered. Behind her, Wright shouted. The two men burst through the front entrance. A waitress screamed. Deborah crashed through the kitchen door. Two cooks looked up in surprise. She ran past them, ignoring their shouts, heading for the back exit she'd spotted through the window earlier. The door was locked. She fired once into the mechanism and kicked it open. Outside, she ran into the maze of dumpsters and loading areas behind the strip mall. No vehicle, no escape route except on foot. She could hear pursuit behind her multiple sets of boots on concrete. A chain-link fence separated the commercial area from an industrial park beyond. Deborah threw the Pelican case over, holstered the Glock, and climbed. The fence top was lined with barbed wire that tore at her hands and jacket, but she pushed through, dropped on the other side, grabbed the case, and kept running. The industrial park was mostly empty businesses, shuttered or relocated. Deborah ducked into a warehouse with broken windows, finding herself in a cavernous space filled with empty pallets and debris. She needed to think, needed to understand what had just happened. Wright wasn't a journalist. He worked for Blackstone, which meant her uploads had been the right call, the essential insurance policy. But it also meant they knew she had the evidence, would kill to get it back. And they apparently had resources that included the ability to pose as federal agents. Timothy was alive. After 12 years of thinking him dead, of carrying that guilt, he was alive. Blackstone had been holding him, using him for something. The voicemail she'd found made perfect sense now. He'd been trying to warn her even while being held captive. Deborah had to get out of Pineville, had to disappear long enough for the evidence she'd uploaded to gain traction to become public enough that killing her wouldn't matter. But how? She had no vehicle, no friends in this town. And Blackstone clearly had people searching for her actively. Her prepaid phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from an unknown number. "Ms. White, this is FBI Director Sarah Collins. We've been investigating Blackstone for 6 months. We know about Jonathan Wright. We know you uploaded evidence this morning. We need to talk. We can protect you. We can get Timothy Clark out. But you need to trust us." Deborah stared at the message, trying to decide if this was another trap or genuine help. The timing was suspicious, but then again, if she'd uploaded enough evidence to trip automated monitoring systems, the real FBI might have taken notice. She texted back, "How do I know you're really FBI?" The response came quickly. "You don't, but Wright works for Blackstone. Agent Eric King in the mine yesterday works for Blackstone. We've been trying to clean house, but they have people everywhere. Your evidence just gave us the leverage we needed. Meet me at the State Police Barracks in Pineville. Public place. Safe. 1 hour." Deborah considered her options, which had narrowed to essentially 0. She couldn't keep running indefinitely. She needed allies, needed resources. And if this really was the FBI, if they really wanted to take down Blackstone, then they'd need what she had. She texted back a single word, "Okay." Then she left the warehouse, kept to alleys and side streets, and made her way toward the State Police Barracks, carrying the evidence that had cost Timothy 12 years of his life, and had cost her everything she'd built, hoping that this time, finally, she'd chosen the right side. If you could save one life, but risk everything you have left, would you do it? The State Police Barracks in Pineville occupied a squat brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and never updated. Deborah approached from across the street, studying every vehicle in the parking lot, every window, every possible angle of attack. 2 marked cruisers sat near the entrance, a handful of civilian vehicles, nothing that screamed trap, but after what had happened at the diner, she trusted nothing. She crossed the street and entered through the front door. A desk sergeant looked up, middle-aged and professional, his expression shifting to mild concern when he saw her condition. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I'm here to see Director Collins. She's expecting me." The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly, but he picked up a phone, spoke quietly, then nodded. "Conference room B, down the hall, second door on your left." The hallway smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. Deborah found the conference room and entered to find a woman waiting. Late 50s gray hair, cut short, dressed in a dark suit that marked her as federal rather than local law enforcement. She stood when Deborah entered and extended a hand. "Ms. White, I'm Sarah Collins, FBI Director. Thank you for trusting us enough to come here." Deborah shook the offered hand, but kept her other hand near the Glock. "I'm not sure I do trust you yet." "That's smart. Given what you've been through, paranoia is a survival trait." Collins gestured to chairs around the table. "Please sit. We have a lot to discuss and not much time." Deborah sat, but positioned herself where she could see both the door and Collins clearly. She set the Pelican case on the table between them. "You said you've been investigating Blackstone for 6 months. If that's true, why am I the first person to actually expose them?" Collins settled into her chair with the careful posture of someone who spent too much time at desks. "Because until 4 hours ago, we didn't have evidence that would hold up in court. Blackstone is very good at compartmentalization, very good at using shell companies and cutouts. We knew they were dirty, but we couldn't prove it. Then you uploaded those files, and suddenly every news organization in the country is calling us demanding comment. The uploads went live about 3 hours ago. Twitter's on fire with hashtag Blackstone Leaks. The Times just published a preliminary story based on the documents. CNN's running it as breaking news. You didn't just crack this open, Ms. White. You blew it into orbit." Something in Deborah's chest loosened fractionally. The evidence was out. Even if Blackstone killed her now, the truth was in the world where it couldn't be suppressed or erased. "What about Timothy Clark? Is he really alive?" Collins' expression shifted, became more guarded. "We believe so. Intelligence suggests Blackstone has been operating a facility in West Virginia. Black River, they call it, internally. We've had surveillance on it for 2 months, but haven't been able to get a warrant. The legal justifications weren't solid enough. But now, with your evidence, we have probable cause." "You're going to raid it?" "Tonight. Hostage rescue team is being briefed as we speak. But, Ms. White, I need to be direct with you. There's a chance Timothy Clark didn't survive 12 years of captivity. There's a chance what we find there won't be what you're hoping for." Deborah's hands clenched on the table edge. "I understand, but we have to try." He held on because he believed someone would finish what he started. "I finished it. Now I need to bring him home." Collins studied her for a long moment. "You want to be there when we go in?" "Yes." "That's operationally inadvisable for about 15 different reasons. You're not trained for tactical situations. You could be a liability. You could get hurt or killed." "I'm going to be there," Deborah said, her voice flat and absolute. "Because Timothy needs to see a friendly face. Because after 12 years alone, he needs to know someone came for him. I don't care about the operational concerns. Make it work, or I walk out of here and you lose your best witness." Collins considered this, fingers drumming on the table. "All right, but you follow orders from the team leader. You stay back until the facility is secure." And if things go sideways, you get out and let the professionals handle it. Agreed? Agreed. The raid was set for 4 a.m. the following morning. Collins explained that meant Deborah had roughly 12 hours to prepare. The FBI would provide clean clothes, food, a place to rest. They'd transport her to the staging area and brief her on protocols. In return, she needed to turn over the Pelican case and all original evidence for processing. Deborah hesitated. Surrendering the case felt like giving up her only leverage, but Collins seemed to read her thoughts. "Ms. Wyatt, the evidence is already public. You don't need to keep it as insurance anymore, and we need the originals for chain of custody. If we're going to prosecute Jennifer Williams and everyone else involved, we need documentation that will hold up under legal scrutiny." It made sense. Deborah opened the Pelican case and began removing contents, laying them on the table. The documents, the micro SD card, the satellite phone. Collins called in 2 other agents who photographed everything, documented the chain of custody, and carefully packed it all into evidence bags. While they worked, Collins pulled out a tablet and showed Deborah the news coverage. The story was everywhere. Major networks were running special reports. Reporters were camped outside Blackstone's corporate headquarters. Congressional representatives were calling for investigations. The stock market had suspended trading on Blackstone shares after they'd dropped 60% in 3 hours. "This is already bigger than Watergate," Collins said quietly. "You've created a political and legal earthquake. Whatever happens from here, you changed everything." But what broke Deborah wasn't seeing him alive. It was realizing he'd held on for 12 years, believing she'd come. Wait, that thought felt premature. She hadn't seen Timothy yet. Deborah shook her head, trying to clear exhaustion-induced confusion. The FBI put her in a safe house for the night, a nondescript apartment in a secure building. 2 agents stood guard outside. Deborah showered for the first time in nearly a week, standing under hot water until it ran cold. She ate real food pasta with sauce that didn't come from an MRE pouch and tried to sleep on a bed that felt impossibly soft after nights on the ground. Sleep was fragmentary at best. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the skeleton in the Apache cockpit, saw Timothy's face from 12 years ago laughing at some joke she couldn't remember, saw the mine where she'd abandoned Rex, and guilt about that threatened to overwhelm everything else. At 3 a.m., an agent knocked and told her it was time. Deborah dressed in the tactical clothing they'd provided, black cargo pants, dark shirt boots that actually fit properly. They gave her body armor that she had to argue her way out of wearing due to her shoulder. The compromise was a lighter vest that didn't require full range of motion to put on. The drive to the staging area took 90 minutes through pre-dawn darkness. Deborah rode in an unmarked SUV with Collins and 2 other agents, nobody speaking, everyone lost in their own pre-mission thoughts. They arrived at a temporary command post set up in a school parking lot 20 miles from the target. The hostage rescue team commander briefed her curtly. His name was Miller, and he clearly wasn't happy about a civilian being involved. But Collins had pulled rank, and so Miller grudgingly outlined what would happen. The team would breach at 4 a.m. exactly, 2 entry points simultaneously, suppress any resistance, secure the facility floor by floor. Hostages would be extracted immediately. Deborah would wait at the perimeter until she received all clear, then she could enter under escort. And if things go wrong, Deborah asked, if things go wrong, you get in that van and you leave. No arguments. Clear, clear. The convoy rolled out at 3:45, 6 tactical vehicles plus support units. They approached Black River facility through forest roads with lights off using night vision equipment. Deborah rode in the command vehicle with Collins and Miller, watching through monitors as forward units reported positions. Black River turned out to be an old military installation repurposed by Blackstone for purposes that were about to be forcibly revealed. Chain link fence topped with razor wire, guard towers that appeared unmanned at this hour, a main building that looked like an oversized warehouse, several smaller support structures. At 3:58, the teams were in position. Deborah watched the countdown on Miller's tactical display. At exactly 4 a.m., both entry teams moved. The breach was loud and fast and terrifyingly professional. Flash-bang grenades, shouted commands, the staccato crack of suppressed weapons. Through the radio chatter and monitor feeds, Deborah tried to piece together what was happening. Resistance at the main entrance. 2 hostiles down. Teams advancing through corridors. No civilians visible on first floor. Then one of the team leaders reported finding stairs to a basement level. They descended and the radio traffic intensified. Multiple locked doors, signs of long-term occupancy. And then, finally, the call Deborah had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. Command, we have possible hostages. Basement level west corridor. Medical assessment needed immediately. Collins looked at Deborah. That's your cue. But remember, wait for all clear. The wait was agonizing. Another 5 minutes while teams cleared the remaining rooms and secured the perimeter. Finally, Miller gave the authorization and an agent escorted Deborah into the building. Inside the facility looked like a black site from a nightmare. Sterile corridors lit by fluorescent lights. Security doors with keypads, no windows. The basement stairs descended into a level that felt buried and forgotten, a place where people could be kept indefinitely without the outside world ever knowing. The agent led her to a corridor where medical personnel were already working. 3 rooms had been used for long-term confinement. The first 2 were empty, but showed signs of recent occupancy. The 3rd room held Timothy Clark. Deborah stopped in the doorway, unable to process what she was seeing. Timothy sat on a cot wrapped in a blanket someone had given him while a paramedic took his vitals. He looked nothing like the man she remembered. The Timothy from 12 years ago had been strong vital, filled with energy and humor. This Timothy was emaciated, his body reduced to angles and hollow spaces. His hair had gone completely white. His skin held the pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in years. But when he looked up and saw her, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, and then something that might have been hope or might have been disbelief. "Deb!" His voice came out as a rasp barely audible. "Is that? You're real." Deborah crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to her knees beside the cot. Up close, he looked even worse. Scars from old injuries, bruises in various stages of healing, the wear of a decade of captivity etched into every line of his face. "I'm real. I'm here. I found what you left. I finished it." Timothy's hand reached out tentatively, like he was afraid she might disappear if he touched her. His fingers brushed her arm, and he let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. 12 years. I thought you'd never find it. Thought they'd keep me here until I died." They tried to kill me, tried to bury it all. But you made sure they couldn't. Everything you documented, everything you preserved, it's public now. The whole world knows what Blackstone did." A paramedic interrupted professional, but just urgent. "Ma'am, we need to transport him immediately. He's severely malnourished, possible pneumonia, and his vitals are unstable." Deborah stood, giving them space to work. She watched as they prepared Timothy for transport, fitting him with an IV, wrapping him in thermal blankets. He kept looking at her like she might vanish, kept reaching out to confirm she was really there. "I'm not going anywhere," she told him. "I'll be right behind you. I promise." They carried him out on a stretcher and loaded him into an ambulance. Deborah followed in another vehicle, racing through dawn-lit roads toward a military hospital where Timothy could receive proper care. She sat in the back of the SUV, hands shaking with adrenaline crash, trying to process that it was over. She'd actually done it. She'd found the evidence, survived the pursuit, exposed the truth, and brought Timothy home. Except it wasn't really over. Not yet. The arrest started within hours. Jennifer Williams was taken into custody at her Virginia estate at 6 a.m., federal agents executing a warrant, while news helicopters circled overhead broadcasting the scene live. She maintained her composure even in handcuffs, her expression cold and controlled as they led her to an unmarked car. By noon, 12 more arrests had been made. The 2 generals Timothy had named in his documents, 3 congressional aides, 7 executives at companies that had facilitated the arms transfers. Eric King, the FBI agent who'd been working for Blackstone, was found attempting to flee to Mexico and was arrested at the border. Jonathan Wright, the fake journalist, was picked up at a hotel in D.C. He immediately requested a lawyer and refused to say anything, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Blackstone had paid him over $2 million in the past 5 years to pose as a reporter and manage information when necessary. The media coverage was relentless. Every network ran continuous coverage. Talking heads debated the implications. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from Blackstone and any appearance of having benefited from the company's activities. The stock market remained in chaos, with defense contractor stocks dropping across the board on fears of increased oversight. Deborah watched it all from Timothy's hospital room. He'd been stabilized, but remained critically ill. The doctors said he'd need months of treatment. 12 years of malnutrition and stress had damaged his body in ways that might never fully heal. But he was alive and getting stronger each day, and that was enough. On the 3rd day, Collins came to the hospital with news. "We need you to testify. The U.S. attorney wants to move quickly on prosecution. Jennifer Williams is already making noise about fighting this. Her lawyers are claiming the evidence was obtained illegally, that the whole thing is a political witch hunt. We need you to establish chain of custody and context for what Timothy documented." Deborah looked at Timothy, sleeping in the bed, machines monitoring his every vital sign. When preliminary hearings start next week, grand jury proceedings after that. Full trial probably won't happen for months, but we need to lock in testimony while everything is fresh. "I'll do it, whatever you need." The preliminary hearing took place in federal court in Alexandria, Virginia. Deborah wore a suit borrowed from an FBI agent, felt uncomfortable and exposed without her tactical clothing and weapons. But she took the stand and told her story under oath. Finding the helicopter, retrieving the evidence, being hunted across 75 miles of wilderness, meeting the fake journalist, uploading the files that broke everything open. Jennifer Williams sat at the defense table with her 8-lawyer team, watching Deborah with an expression that gave nothing away. When Deborah mentioned finding Timothy alive, Williams's mask slipped fractionally. Just a tiny shift around her eyes quickly controlled. But it was enough to confirm that yes, she'd known exactly where Timothy was and what they'd been doing to him. The defense attorney cross-examined, aggressively trying to establish that Deborah had stolen evidence, that she'd acted as a vigilante, that her testimony couldn't be trusted because she'd been suffering from PTSD and exhaustion. But the evidence spoke for itself. The videos, the documents, Timothy's testimony from his hospital bed via video link, his emaciated appearance making a stronger argument than any lawyer's words could provide. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Jennifer Williams was denied bail on flight risk concerns. The other defendants received various bail conditions based on their individual circumstances. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed Deborah. She made a brief statement prepared by Collins. Timothy Clark spent 12 years in captivity because he tried to expose criminal activity. I'm grateful we could bring him home. I hope justice will be served for him and for all the veterans betrayed by people who put profit over the lives of American service members. Then she got into a waiting car and escaped before they could ask follow-up questions. The trial itself didn't begin until 3 months later. By then, Timothy had been released from the hospital to a rehabilitation facility. He'd gained back 20 pounds and could walk short distances without assistance. The psychological damage would take longer to address, but therapists were working with him daily. Deborah visited him every week, bringing news from the outside world. Sometimes they talked about old times, shared memories from before everything went wrong. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. The 12 years that had passed couldn't be erased, but they could at least move forward together. The trial lasted 8 weeks. Prosecutors presented the video evidence, the documents testimony from dozens of witnesses. They established that Blackstone had been systematically selling American military hardware to terrorist organizations and other hostile actors for over a decade, that Jennifer Williams had personally overseen the operation and pocketed hundreds of millions in profits, that she'd ordered the elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the scheme, including Timothy Clark. The defense argued that Williams had been following government guidance, that she'd believed the transactions were authorized, that she'd been a patriot serving her country's interests. They produced witnesses who testified to her charitable work and her support for veterans' causes. They tried to paint Timothy as unstable and Deborah as a conspiracy theorist with an axe to grind. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, they found Jennifer Williams guilty on 17 counts, including arms trafficking, conspiracy, racketeering, and kidnapping. The courtroom erupted in reaction, some celebrating, others shocked. Williams's face remained impassive as the verdicts were read, but when the judge remanded her to custody pending sentencing, something finally cracked in her composure. She looked around the courtroom as if searching for someone who might save her, but found only the weight of her own choices staring back. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge gave Williams 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. At 52 years old, she would be 97 if she ever walked free again. The judge's statement was scathing. "You betrayed your country for profit. You enabled America's enemies. You destroyed lives and families in service of greed. This court finds no mitigating circumstances that would justify leniency." Williams was led from the courtroom in shackles. As she passed the gallery where Deborah and Timothy sat, her eyes met Deborah's for just a moment. There was hate there and resentment, but also something that might have been acknowledgement. "You won. You beat me. I underestimated what one determined person could accomplish, but the victory felt incomplete, because while Williams had been sentenced, not everyone paid for their crimes. The two generals retired quietly with full pensions and moved to countries without extradition treaties. Two of the congressional aides received plea deals and served minimal time. Several defense contractors involved in the scheme were never charged due to insufficient evidence directly linking them to the conspiracy. Eric King cooperated fully and received 15 years instead of life. Jonathan Wright got 10 years for his role in the cover-up. Various lower-level participants received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years, depending on their involvement and willingness to testify. Justice had been served, but it was messy and imperfect and left gaps where guilty people walked free. Deborah struggled with that reality in the months following the trial. She'd expected something cleaner, more definitive. Instead, she got the complicated truth that the legal system was designed by humans and reflected all their flaws and limitations. Timothy took it more philosophically during one of her visits. "We got the main ones. We exposed the system. We made it harder for this to happen again. That's more than I ever thought possible when I was sitting in that cell thinking nobody would ever find what I'd hidden. But there are still people out there who helped them, people who knew what was happening and did nothing. There always will be. That's the world we live in. But we made it a little better. We told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. That has to count for something." Deborah wanted to believe him. Some days she did. Other days, the weight of everything that had been lost, her cabin, her isolation, her carefully constructed walls, Rex felt too heavy to carry. The FBI eventually found Rex. He'd emerged from Widow's Maw on his own 3 days after Deborah had escaped and been found by a local farmer who'd seen the news coverage and connected the dog to Deborah's story. The farmer had called the FBI, and Rex had been returned to her at a ceremony that felt exploitative, but at least resulted in her getting her dog back. Rex was older now, slower, his muzzle more gray than it had been. But he remembered her, and she remembered him, and they rebuilt their bond over walks that were shorter than before, but just as meaningful. 1 year after the trial, Deborah bought a small house in Montana. Not a cabin this time, an actual house with electricity and plumbing and windows that locked properly. She furnished it, simply kept her go-bag by the door out of habit, and tried to build something resembling a normal life. Timothy came to visit once he'd recovered enough to travel. They sat on her porch, drinking coffee and watching the mountains turn purple in the sunset. "What do you do with your days?" he asked. "I teach survival skills to veterans who are struggling with the transition to civilian life, people who feel lost, like I did, like you did. I try to give them tools to find their way." That's good. That's really good, Deb. What about you? I'm writing a book, Memoir of the Captivity and Everything That Led to It. My therapist says it's good for processing trauma. My publisher says it'll be a bestseller. He smiled wryly. I'm not sure how I feel about profiting from it, but maybe the money can do some good. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who'd survived the unsurvivable and come out the other side scarred but functional. Do you ever regret it? Timothy asked quietly. Everything you lost, the life you had. Deborah considered the question seriously. That life was a lie. I was hiding from the world, from myself, from everything that hurt too much to face. You gave me a reason to stop hiding, to be part of something that mattered. So no, I don't regret it. I just wish it hadn't cost so much. Me too. 6 months after that conversation, Deborah was called to testify before a congressional committee investigating defense contractor oversight. She sat in a hearing room full of cameras and politicians and told them what she'd learned, that the system had failed, that too many people had been looking the other way for too long, that Timothy Clark and others like him had paid the price for that willful blindness. A senator asked her what message she had for other veterans who felt abandoned by the institutions they'd served. Deborah thought about her answer carefully before speaking. I spent 12 years believing I was alone, believing that staying silent and isolated was the only way to survive. But the truth is, you're not alone. Your voice matters. Your experiences matter. And sometimes one person telling the truth can change everything. Timothy Clark proved that. I just finished what he started. She paused, feeling the weight of the moment. The system isn't perfect. Justice isn't always complete. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for it. That doesn't mean we give up. Because every small victory adds up. Every truth exposed makes the next truth harder to hide. We honor the fallen by refusing to let their sacrifices be forgotten or erased. The committee room was silent for a moment after she finished. Then the chairman thanked her for her service and her courage and moved to the next witness. Outside reporters wanted statements. Deborah gave them one final quote. Some people say I'm a hero, but I'm not. Heroes are the people who didn't make it home, the people who died trying to do the right thing. I'm just someone who survived long enough to tell their story, and I'll keep telling it until people listen. Justice isn't always perfect. It isn't always complete. But does that mean we stop fighting for it? That question stayed with Deborah in the years that followed. She never found a satisfying answer, but she kept showing up, kept teaching veterans, kept telling Timothy's story and her own, kept pushing back against the forces that wanted truth buried and uncomfortable questions silenced. Timothy's book became a bestseller just as his publisher predicted. He donated most of the proceeds to veterans organizations and spent his time speaking at military bases about the importance of integrity and accountability. His health improved slowly, but never fully recovered. The 12 years of captivity had taken too much. Rex lived another 3 years before age finally claimed him. Deborah buried him on her property in Montana under a pine tree with a view of the mountains. She carved a simple marker, Rex, good dog, loyal friend, and she planted wildflowers that would bloom every spring. She didn't get another dog. One Rex was enough for a lifetime. 5 years after the trial, Deborah received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, two men in business suits at an airport, faces clearly visible, and a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. "They're still operating. Stay vigilant." Deborah stared at the photograph for a long time. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let someone else chase this particular ghost. She'd done her part. She'd paid her dues. She'd earned the right to walk away. But the larger part of her, the part that had crawled through a tunnel with a broken shoulder, that had walked 75 miles through wilderness, that had stood up in front of Congress and told uncomfortable truths, that part wouldn't let her simply walk away. She called Timothy. "I got something in the mail today, something you should see." Another lead. "Maybe, probably. I don't know if I have another fight like this in me." Timothy was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. Whatever it is, we handle it together. That's what we should have done 12 years ago." Deborah looked out her window at the Montana landscape, at the life she'd built, from the ashes of everything she'd lost. "All right, come out here and we'll figure out what this means. Together. Give me 2 days." She hung up and sat with the photograph, with the implicit promise that the fight wasn't really over, would probably never be fully over. But this time, she wouldn't face it alone. This time, she had allies, had resources, had the experience of having won once and knowing she could win again if necessary. The phone rang. Unknown number. Deborah answered cautiously. A woman's voice, young and frightened. "Ms. White? You don't know me, but I think I found something. Something like what you found, and now people are following me. I don't know who else to call. Please, I need help." Deborah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders again. "Where are you?" "Wyoming. Small town called Sheridan. I can't talk about it over the phone, but if what I found is real, it's bigger than Blackstone, much bigger." "Stay somewhere public. Don't be alone. I'll be there in 2 days. Can you stay safe that long?" "I think so. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering." The woman hung up. Deborah sat with the phone in her hand, understanding that this was her life now. This was who she'd become. Not the woman hiding in a cabin, not the veteran retreating from the world, but the person people called when they needed someone to stand up against forces too powerful to fight alone. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the peace she'd imagined, but it was a life with purpose, with meaning, with the knowledge that her experiences and her survival meant something beyond just her own existence. She called Timothy back. "Change of plans. We're going to Wyoming." "What's in Wyoming?" "Another person who found something they weren't supposed to find. Another truth that needs telling." "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious. Are you with me?" Timothy laughed, the sound still rusty, but genuine. "Always was, Deb. Always will be. Let's go save the world again." Deborah packed her bag, the same military pack she'd carried through the wilderness 5 years ago, patched and worn, but still functional. She loaded her Glock, checked her supplies, and made arrangements for her house to be looked after while she was gone. Before she left, she stood on her porch one last time, looking at the mountains she'd come to love, the place she'd found after losing everything else. Part of her wondered if she'd make it back. Part of her wondered if she'd find another cabin to burn down, another life to leave behind in pursuit of truth. But mostly, she just felt ready. Ready to do it again, ready to honor the dead by refusing to let their sacrifices be meaningless, ready to prove that one person could still make a difference, even in a world designed to make individuals feel powerless. Have you ever had to choose between staying safe and doing what's right? What would you have done in Deborah's position? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you believe truth is worth fighting for. Deborah locked the door behind her, got in her truck, and drove toward Wyoming with the sun rising behind her, casting long shadows ahead that looked like roads she hadn't traveled yet, but would soon enough, because that's what you did when someone called for help, and you were one of the few people in the world who understood what it cost to stand up and what it cost even more to stay silent.